Thank you all so much for coming. So, my name is Reese Mallow. I'm the president of the Leo's Club. This is the Leo's first big event, so we are thrilled that you are all here. Thank you so much. So tonight is the Tick Talk, where we will have David Hunter talking about ticks and tick-borne illnesses. So I'm just going to give a little overview about what the Leos are. So the Leos program, sponsored by Lions Club International, is gives people in our community a powerful way to learn about leadership through service. Leos work together with hands-on projects that build responsibility, teamwork, and a lifelong commitment to helping others. The Leos program strengthens the next generation of service-minded leaders who are ready to make a difference locally and around the world. So I'm just going to read a quick portion of David Hunter's bio. So David Hunter has been a longtime Lyme activist advocating for patients on both the state and local level in Connecticut and New Hampshire. He was chairman of the Committee for Education Reform with Children with Lyme disease. In that role, he lobbied for mandated Lyme in servicing of all teachers and administrators in public schools in Connecticut. David was also the chairman of the Tri-Berry Lyme Disease Task Force and facilitator for the Tri-Berry Lyme Disease Support Group in Southbury, Connecticut. He was a member of the Connecticut Lyme Group in the Connecticut Lyme Disease Coalition, which planned and organized the 2004 Lyme hearing in Hartford, Department of Public Health Commissioner Robert Galvin. Throughout these years of advocacy, David has given numerous Lyme presentations in an effort to raise public awareness and correct the many myths and misunderstandings that are associated with Lyme disease. He has also helped thousands of patients sort through their symptoms and illness and helped guide them to proper, more effective care. So I'd like to introduce to you David Hunter.
Thanks, Reese. Let me just get this. So, can you hear me?
Yeah.
As Reese said, I've been doing this since the year 2000, basically. I saw a hand back there, but I'm going to give a talk tonight that'll probably last 45 or 50 minutes. And then I'll open the floor to questions. So just hold your questions until the end. You may hear things along the way that raise questions, but there'll be plenty of time. I'll stay as long as we have to, or as long as you want to answer all questions. It's a disease that I can't thank the Leos enough for doing this. I've given probably 50 talks around New Hampshire. I moved up here in 2007. And I've spoken to groups throughout the state because public awareness is really the key to this. Unfortunately, our doctors don't really understand it. You'll hear in the talk there's some I guess I would say confusion in the medical community, some conflict in the medical community, as well as politics and the disease itself being somewhat confusing. So it's not easy to get care sometimes. And I hope anyway, as we go through the next 45 minutes, you'll get a better sense of this. If I could, before we start, just ask you guys to, by show of hands, who has ever been bit by a tick? Okay. Not surprised, a good number. Of those, how many of you have had Lyme disease? And of those, how many of you have had it in a longer-term chronic way? Yep. So that's part of the situation. We live, obviously, in a very endemic area. New Hampshire is part of the most endemic area in the country. New England, the Northeast, the Upper Midwest, and the West Coast are probably the most prevalent areas. Unfortunately, for a long time, it was kind of spoken as if those were the only areas. Lyme is in every, and ticks that are bearing Lyme are in every state in this country. So It used to be somebody would get bit out in the west somewhere, or out in out in Kansas or somewhere, and they'd say, "Well, you can't have Lyme because you haven't gone anywhere," and you can get Lyme anywhere. It's in every state. Just as an overview in history, Lyme disease was first discovered in the mid-1970s by a woman by the name of Polly Murray, who was a housewife and mother in Old Lyme, Connecticut. She noticed when she'd go to the grocery store that a lot of people were suffering the same symptoms she was suffering, which were a lot of arthritic conditions. And in her neighborhood, her kids and their neighbor friends were all kind of suffering from swollen knees and arthritic joints. So she called the Department of Health in Hartford and asked if they could come down. She said, "There's something going on. It must be environmental because it's all over town." And they put her off for a couple of years. She called many times, and they said, "No, we aren't doing anything." Finally, she had badgered them enough. They sent the Department of Rheumatology from Yale out there, and they took soil samples and looked around at everything, and they came up fairly early on with the understanding that it was coming in through the bite of a tick. They originally called it Lyme arthritis, and because they thought it was a virus or something that was coming in, a virus causing arthritic condition. And that was the mid-70s. It wasn't until the early 1980s that a tick researcher out at the Rocky Mountain Labs in Montana by the name of Willie Bergdorfer got a batch of ticks from Long Island, and he dissected them, and in the process found the bacteria of Lyme in the gut of the tick. And it was from that point forward, it was the bacteria that causes Lyme is known as Borrelia burgdorferi, after Willie Bergdorfer, who discovered that. So if you ever hear somebody say they have Borrelia, what they're talking about is they have Lyme, because the Borrelia burgdorferi is the bacteria that causes Lyme. In terms of ticks and prevention, most of you probably have seen ticks. They are we all see WMUR and the various news programs roll the tape out every spring talking about Lyme disease and have a tick crawling across the screen, and they tell you to watch out for them. I think it's very important to do tick checks, particularly during this time of year, in terms of full body tick checks. These critters will latch on. What they typically do, people think they drop out of trees and things. Not usually. What they usually are doing is they're on a blade of grass or tall blades of grass, and they're questing. They're kind of standing like that, and they sense the carbon dioxide as you walk by, and they will latch on to you. Typically, you'll get them, at in your lower legs or your ankles, and they'll crawl up. So they'll find the soft tissues in your body. So they'll go for the groin or up behind your ears or anywhere where they think they can, poke a hole. So that's the typical way you'll get it. Obviously, if you have pets, they can bring it in with them, and they drop off on the carpet, and you end up with a tick. Or if you let your animals on the bed, just beware that these things are very prevalent. I know there are treatments for the animals, but sometimes they don't always kill the tick either. So prevention. You can spray your yards. I think most people know that a lot of lawn companies and pest control firms offer services where they'll spray your yard a few times a season to try to either eliminate the ticks or at least cut them down quite a bit. The ticks like to hang out in the brush, the kind of the perimeter of the yard. They don't like sun. That doesn't mean you can't find them in the middle of your lawn, but they they tend to hang out under the bushes, along stone walls in the shadier, brushier areas, leave litter, that kind of thing. So, but the biggest thing you can do is the tick checks, and also to be aware of what symptoms are. And if you get symptoms for instance, in the spring or summer, if you get the flu-like symptoms, don't assume it's flu. Think flu-like symptoms. That's a very common sign of early Lyme. Flu-like symptoms, fatigue, obviously a bullseye rash. They can, when they bite, less than 50% of people get a rash. So you may not get a rash, but you might get a bullseye rash. It doesn't have to be a bullseye. It can be another form of rash. But if you see a rash after being outdoors or gardening, that kind of thing, think Lyme disease. In terms of other things you can do, you can either get clothes that are treated by Promethean, which is a natural, I think it's chrysanthemum-based spray, but you can get factory-treated clothing that will go through a lot of washes and still be protective against ticks. Promethean kills the ticks, or at least causes them to detract. Or you can even get sprays and spray your own clothes with them. So those are ways you can kind of cut down the risks. As we talked about, there are basically two forms of Lyme. There's the acute Lyme, which is you get bit, you might get the rash, or you might have flu-like symptoms and fatigue. You go to your doctor, you get treatment for, say, 3 weeks, and you don't have another problem. It eliminates it, and you're pretty good. Or there's, if you don't get there early or don't recognize it, and it's in your system for a longer period of time, it will then become more chronic, and after it goes chronic, it's much harder to treat. The key to treating acute Lyme, which is the early Lyme, is early diagnosis, meaning within days typically of the bite, and proper treatment. And that may sound easy, but I will tell you that because of all the controversy around this disease, our primary care physicians are not necessarily well informed in terms of how best to treat this. Lots of times they will, let's say you go in on a Monday or Tuesday and say, over the weekend I got bit by a tick. And they say, well, we know you got bit just 2 days ago. We'll give you 1 or 2 pills, doxycycline pills. That is something that's in the Infectious Disease Society's guidelines, that 1 or 2 pills is a prophylactic. If you catch it early, you can do that. I will tell you that's a myth. You really want to treat this a minimum of 4 weeks, and a lot of the Lyme literate doctors will treat for 2 months. And that, again, we're all conditioned to think we want to do as little as we can with antibiotics, take them as short as we can. With this, you want to make sure you nip it in the bud when you get it early, because it can be a real neurological nightmare if not caught early. And it's not just how long you treat, it's also the proper dosage. And again, the Infectious Disease Society is responsible for the guidelines that most of the medical establishment follows. And what they tell you is typically 2 or 3 weeks of doxycycline, 100 milligrams twice a day. The Lyme literate community, the Lyme literate doctor community, generally recommends twice that dose, so 200 milligrams twice a day for a month minimum, and maybe longer, but certainly a month. And don't just treat till symptoms are gone, because you want to make sure you've really knocked it out. The one thing you can do is substitute doxycycline, because what happens a lot of times is you go to the doctor, your primary doctor, and he says, no, I'm going by the Infectious Disease Society's recommended dose, we're giving you 100 milligrams twice a day. I've known of several people that have gotten to their doctor early after a bite, gotten their doctor to give them a few weeks of antibiotics, but not a heavy enough dose, and they end up with the chronic illness anyway. So another thing you can do to get around that is substitute doxycycline with minocycline. It is in the same family, the cycline family. It's a better penetrator, and the effective dose is 100 milligrams twice a day. That is also the dose that typically the medical community is comfortable giving. So it gets you around the battle over, can I have 200 milligrams twice a day instead of 100? With minocycline, it's pretty much the same recommendation either way. So just kind of a hint on that. So as I said, if you don't get that early diagnosis and proper treatment, this can turn into something more chronic. I got into this way back in the year 2000. My daughter was just finishing 8th grade. She was a top student in her class, played Olympic development soccer, played cello and piano, was a high achiever. But she said, I'm getting dizzy on the softball field. I went to catch pop-up and I got dizzy. She fell off the risers in chorus. And she was coming home not eating her lunch. We didn't know what was wrong. Took her to her pediatrician. In our case, we were lucky. The pediatrician, the test came back positive, and they said she had Lyme disease. And long story short, she ended up missing high school. When I looked back, I think she got bit. She did get bit the year before, the end of 7th grade. A neighbor had said she was down at a neighbor's pool, and her mom called and said, Joe's got ticks on both her inner thighs. You might want to come down and pull them off. So I did. Didn't recognize her. She didn't act sick. We thought she was okay. And only later on, looking back, there were symptoms and things that we missed. So she went a year before she was diagnosed and treated. By then, it had really gotten into her system. She had Lyme plus other tick-borne illnesses, which I'll talk about in a little while. But she ended up missing the 4 years of high school plus a 5th year. We kept her for services because her brain closed up for 3 years where she couldn't read. And she was a top student in the district in her class. And she went from an A+ student to not being, she goes, I can read this to you, but I can't tell you what it means. And that's what not just Lyme, but the other tick-borne diseases can do in terms of that. Chronic Lyme can also, some of the symptoms of Lyme are that it migrates around the body. So if you have it chronically, you might have it where one day it's your right knee that's bothering you, next day it's your left elbow, and then it's your left knee, then it's your right ankle. So it can migrate around the body, and there's no other disease that does that. So if you get that, where you start feeling like a hypochondriac because it's every other day is something different, that is one of the telltale signs of chronic Lyme. Fatigue, we talk about fatigue with Lyme, and if you've never had chronic Lyme, or even the acute Lyme can cause pretty severe fatigue, if you've never had it, you hear fatigue and you go, yeah, I've had fatigue, I've had a hard week at work and I come home exhausted, or I played a hard tennis match and I was really fatigued. The fatigue of Lyme is bone crushing. It's really debilitating, such that sometimes people will be bedborne for 20 hours a day or more, and they'll say, I'm sick of being in bed, I'm getting up. They get up, put their clothes on, and they used up their energy for the day and had to go get back in bed. So it's very debilitating fatigue. You can have severe pain in all kinds of places in the joints. I had a grown man come to my sport group many years ago, traveled across, I'm in Bedford, traveled across from Rochester, New Hampshire, because he was looking for help, and he just said, nothing's helped me. I've taken narcotics, I've taken everything. I've got pain 24/7. I can't sleep because of it. It's so extreme. I can't imagine. He said it's been going on for months. So just know the pain of this can also be very severe. It's hard because it's not a disease you can see often. I mean, sometimes you see people in wheelchairs or crippled, but most of the time the neurological stuff is not seen. So it's a little hard for people. They look at you. One of the jokes in a sport group of Lyme is, yeah, we're the people that you come in and say, you look fine. You know, you can have one of your worst days, and people come up to you and say, you look good. You must be getting better. And you feel like you're dying inside. So just know this is a disease that's not well understood by either the doctor community or the public. Neuropsychiatric is a very big part of Lyme and the whole tick-borne disease complex. It can cause severe anxiety. It can cause, and again, some of these are Lyme symptoms and some are other co-infections I'll talk about later, but just putting them all together can cause even schizophrenia. It can cause all kinds of cognitive problems. That was, my daughter had one of the co-infections that tends to cause where she couldn't read and couldn't comprehend. That comes typically with one of the co-infections I'll talk about. It can cause, it's kind of the fear of flight thing where, people just, people who are fine all of a sudden don't want to be left alone. Kids that maybe you're teenagers and you could leave alone and you go off to do your errands, and now they're very, they need you around. So it's those kind of things, and any other psychiatric symptoms you can imagine. I'll talk more specifically as we get into it with some of the symptoms of each of the different infections, but Lyme is known as the new great imitator. Anybody want to guess what the original great imitator was? Syphilis. So Lyme is a spirochete. It's a corkscrew-shaped bacteria in the same family as syphilis. It's a distant cousin. So we've known for 100 years what syphilis can do to the brain, right? It can cause real problems. This does a lot of those things and worse. As a new great imitator, it can, and this is why it's so hard for the medical community, along with all the misinformation that's out there, for them to really grasp it, is because it can look like MS, actually can be MS. It can look like Parkinson's. It can look like it can cause ALS. Lupus is oftentimes undiagnosed Lyme. Chronic fatigue syndrome is typically Lyme disease that's not diagnosed. Fibromyalgia is again another. These are diseases diagnosed mostly as syndromes, as lists of symptoms. Those symptoms totally overlap, and whereas Lyme is an actual bacterial infection, because the medical community doesn't understand it, they oftentimes don't. They'll do a blood test, and tests aren't very reliable, so it comes back negative, and they say, well, we tested you for Lyme, so it's not Lyme. And then you proceed to get sicker and sicker, and you get put in one of these categories depending on your symptoms. So oftentimes, if somebody has MS, I would be telling them very strongly, get to a Lyme litter doctor and get tested properly and get worked up properly, because you may in fact have something that's treatable. Not just treat symptoms, but actually treatable. It can cause bipolar disease. That's one of the neuropsychiatric symptoms of Lyme is bipolar disease. OCD is very typical in one of the co-infections. Even autism, I would say probably a third of the autistic spectrum is probably tick-borne disease, maybe more. And just keep in mind, Lyme can be passed from mother to child in utero. So a lot of times the autistic kids are kids that had it passed at birth, and you never knew. I mean, you're not thinking, well, they didn't get bad, or you haven't seen any new onset of an infection, but it can actually have come in at birth. So, and again, these are things If the medical community doesn't understand this, then our schools don't understand this. And these are kids that are actually, in many cases, able to be treated. It's not an easy process. It can be a long-term process to treat, but there are many a success story where they've been treated. So it's just a shame. We really are still in the dark ages in terms of, it's getting better in terms of public awareness that Lyme is something to take seriously. But beyond that, all these more detailed parts of it are not well understood still in the medical community or in the education community. I had a case, ADD is another one that can be, I'm not saying all ADD is Lyme, but it can be another symptom of Lyme. Depression and anything neuropsychiatric, depression certainly, and anxiety certainly. I had a case in my support group in Bedford, a woman, she was very active in NAMI because she had a child that as a teenager got diagnosed with schizophrenia, a late teenager, and she had 6 boys, 5 of them were healthy, and this one, by the time she had come to a support group and had discovered Lyme as a possibility, he was, I think, in his mid-20s, but she said, I lost him at, I don't know, 18 or 19. She goes, I couldn't have conversations with him. He was fine, and then all of a sudden he wasn't. He ended up in living away in a home with other schizophrenics, and she said, we can't really, he's in his own world. She got him diagnosed. She took him to a Lyme doctor. He got diagnosed with Lyme and Bartonella, which is one of the tick-borne diseases, got treated, and it took a couple of years, but that schizophrenia went away. She told me he's interacting with his brothers. He's got a girlfriend, and he's living a normal life, totally. And so, for maybe 5 years or 6 years, he was living a life of a schizophrenic, and then came back to a normal life. And I'm not sure whether he ever knew what happened in between, but it's really an amazing thing to see what this, what these infections can do. The other thing to know is with when you go to Lyme litter doctors, even the CDC says that Lyme is a clinical diagnosis. The testing, which we'll talk about, is highly unreliable. So a lot of times you can't just go by a blood test. You have to get a workup based on your symptoms, and the doctors that are familiar with Lyme, and what we call Lyme litter doctors, are the ones that basically their practices get taken over by Lyme. It's as much a specialty as a oncologist is to cancer. You wouldn't go to a PCP for cancer, right? You would want to see an oncologist. With Lyme, I would tell you, again, acute Lyme, you might get away with just seeing your PCP as long as you can get the proper treatment. But once it goes chronic, you want to see a Lyme litter practitioner. It can be an MD, or it might be a naturopath, or some other alternative medicine. But it just, it's a rare case that a PCP is at all educated enough in this to be able to properly take care of you. The testing, just to kind of go through the testing, again, we all know, I think, or most people today know, if you get bit by a tick, it's a 2-tiered testing system that the CDC recommends. So they do a first blood test, which is called an ELISA test, and it screens you in or out, and it's a titer, so it will tell you whether it looks like you have Lyme. If you get a negative on that, they don't go further. If you get a positive on that, they say, okay, now we want to do the confirming test, which is a Western blot. Sometimes your PCPs, in fact, a lot of times now they go right to the Western blot, but it's another test to test for the antibodies of the bacteria. With the main labs, LabCorp or Quest or some of the hospital labs, the joke I used to tell was, if you don't want to have Lyme, go to Quest, because they'll never find it. The tests are just so unreliable that oftentimes it comes back negative, and then you're told you don't have Lyme and you don't go further with it. So just know that, you know, taking a blood test and getting a negative is not where you want to stop. There are labs, probably the most Lyme literate or most well-known lab for Lyme testing is Hygienics. They're out in Palo Alto, California. Again, it's getting better. When I came into this, you know, even 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 15 or 20 years ago, you'd go to your PCP and say, I hear Hygienics is the lab, and they go, oh, that's a bogus lab, don't go there. That happens to be by far the best Lyme literate, best, most accurate testing for Lyme, and it's a very strong, you know, they follow all kinds of procedures and protocols. It's just because of the politics that it got kind of bad-mouthed, and it wasn't, and it's also, you have to pay out of pocket, and it's more expensive. But if you really suspect Lyme and your other tests aren't picking it up, that's the one probably to go to. And there are a bunch of different tests you can do for the Lyme, but also you want to do a full panel for other co-infections, because it's very common when you get bit by a tick, you might just have Lyme, but more often than not, you have Lyme plus 1, 2, 3, or 4 other co-infections. And so they do panels. If you order the panels, you can test for all of those things. In terms of treatment, you know, there's all kinds of, obviously, if you have this for a long time, you're probably been through the gamut of different kinds of treatment. People will try antibiotics, they'll try alternative medicine, they'll try, you know, herbs and tinctures and homeopathic. There's all kinds of things you can do. Even magnets and things people have tried. So there are lots of alternatives, but typically when you first are dealing with chronic Lyme, you're going to either a Lyme littered MD and maybe treating with both either just antibiotics or antibiotics and herbs, or you're going to another alternative treatment that might be homeopathic or just tinctures or what have you. But it's, you know, again, the key with this is that once it gets beyond that first month or two, it can be a long process. You can't just say, well, I tried to treat it for 6 months and I'm not better. It's not unusual for people to treat for 2, 3, 4, 5 years or longer. Maybe not entirely. Maybe they'll stop for a little while and then start again. But, you know, it's a nightmare to treat sometimes if it's really embedded in you. If you do go on long-term antibiotics, it's key to take probiotics because you're killing off the bacteria, the good bacteria in your gut. So supplementing with probiotics, acidophilus type products is typically important to keep your gut healthy. And again, there are lots of people who choose not to do the antibiotic route and go other ways, and there's nothing wrong with that. You just have to find somebody that really understands Lyme and treats properly. Probably the other most important thing in my whole talk is these co-infections. There are many co-infections. The most common ones, I call them the 3 Bs. Lyme is Borrelia, so that's one B. But the 2 other co-infections that travel with Lyme commonly are Babesia, which is a malaria-like parasite. So it's not a bacteria, it's actually a malaria-like parasite that gets into your bloodstream. And Bartonella. So Borrelia, Babesia, and Bartonella are the most common. When you get bit by a tick, it's not unusual to have all 3 of those or 2 of those, the 3. And it's so important, you can't treat with one treatment. You can't just say, yeah, I treated my Lyme, how come I'm not better? You have to attack all of them. And in fact, the bacteria work synergistically with each other to kind of protect. I had a case where I used to get a lot of calls, not as many now, but where I'd spend an hour on the phone with somebody, and I said, I'm not a doctor, I can't diagnose you, or I can tell you, though, from 20 years of experience, if you give me a list of your symptoms, I can kind of tell you which of those symptoms are more likely Lyme, which of them are Babesia or Bartonella. And I had a woman in one particular case where she clearly had Lyme and Babesia, and I said, you have very clear symptoms of Lyme and Babesia. I don't see any symptoms of Bartonella or Ehrlichia or some of the others. But when you see the Lyme doctor, just make sure that you get diagnosed with both. I can't, don't tell them I told you this, just let them go through and tell them the symptoms. I didn't hear from her for the next year, they call in and they move on. She didn't come to the support group. She called me a year later, and I used to take notes, so I looked at her and I looked at the records, and I said, and she's going, I'm calling because I spent a year with that doctor and I'm not really any better. He said he doesn't know what to do now. He's treated me several treatments, and I'm not getting better. He said, I've done what I can do. She goes, so I'm calling back to see what else I can do. And I looked at my notes and I said, did you get treated with both Lyme and Babesia? He said, no. And I said, do you remember? I said, make sure that you get diagnosed for both. Make sure he's, if he doesn't diagnose it initially, bring it up. And she, I guess I forgot. I said, well, go back to him. Again, the doctors don't want me diagnosing them. I said, don't go back and tell him I said you have it, but go back to him and list these symptoms, which are Babesia symptoms, and say, don't I have Babesia, or do I have Babesia? And she called me or came to the support group a few months later, and she goes, thank you very much. In 3 months, I've gotten so much better. All that year I've made so much more progress than I did then. And the lesson of that is the Babesia was actually standing in a way of treating the Lyme. So you weren't getting anywhere, you're just spinning your wheels. So it's really important to also get these co-infections diagnosed. And I can tell you your primary care physicians do not understand these. Sometimes they might, occasionally they might, but it's really the case far more often than not that they're not going to, they hear Lyme and they will look for Lyme. They don't know Bartonella, they don't know Babesia. For example, Bartonella is not even listed on the infectious disease guidelines, which are the primary guidelines for tick-borne disease. They list Babesia, they list Ehrlichia, which is another one, another common one here, anaplasmosis, another common one in New Hampshire. But Bartonella is considered, by the way, Bartonella is cat scratch disease. So if you know it from, you probably have heard of somebody can get Bartonella from a cat scratch, or a feral cat might bring it in. But it can also be a tick-borne disease, and is actually as common as Lyme is now. And yet the infectious disease site, which is the medical establishment's guidelines for treating Lyme and co-infections, doesn't even mention it, doesn't even consider it a tick-borne disease. So it's really, you have to be armed with that knowledge, and you have to get to somebody that will understand that. And Bartonella is another one where the tests are not very reliable. IGeneX does pretty good with it. There's a lab down in Raleigh, North Carolina, that was founded by a veterinarian. Again, cat scratch disease. A lot of his vets were getting Bartonella from working with animals, working with cats. He ended up being kind of the world's foremost expert on Bartonella. He's got a lab where the tests are quite good for Bartonella. So the lab's name is Galaxy Lab. So, I mean, because Bartonella is so common, I just want people to realize, because we hear Lyme disease, everybody hears Lyme disease. Know that Bartonella is just as prevalent, and Bartonella is the disease that when I talk about schizophrenia, OCD, probably autism, I think is more likely that. Bartonella is the one that's really highly neuropsychiatric. Lyme causes memory loss and what we call brain fog. Bartonella tends to cause the cognitive, where I said my daughter couldn't read or had trouble, with numbers and things, and she was really good in math. It shuts down the cognitive side. So oftentimes I'll have people say, yeah, I have brain fog. I go, well, be more specific, because brain fog, I can't tell whether that's the Bartonella side of things, the cognitive side, or more just the memory side, which is, not that memory is not important, but which is more specific to Lyme. So just know that these diseases overlap, but there are some specific symptoms that can help tease them out. Babesia, by the way, being a malaria-like disease, when you first get bit, and if you have babesia, oftentimes you'll have night sweats. And then they might go away after a couple weeks after the organism settles in, a couple weeks or a month. And you might think, oh, I guess that's handled. But it's still there, and oftentimes it'll come back as you treat. The night sweats might come out again. Oftentimes babesia patients, particularly chronic ones, have real heat sensitivity, so they might have used to like to go to the beach and now they can't stand being out in the sun. That's a pretty common one. Babesia oftentimes causes air hunger, and that's when you go to take a breath, you can't get a full breath, it cuts out. And so it sometimes gets mistook for COPD or something else, but air hunger is a very common symptom. And it can cause POTS, which is a situation where your blood pressure drops quickly when you stand up. So if you're sitting in a chair and then you get up, you might feel faint, or they oftentimes will do a tilt table test at the hospital, will check, and it creates a neurological symptom, a posterior symptom where your blood pressure drops quickly and you can get very faint very quickly or pass out. So babesia is that. The Bartonella is typically, whereas Lyme is typically joint pain. If you have physical, it'll be the migrating symptoms and be in your joints. Bartonella more often is typically in your bones. So if you feel pain deep in your hips or your shins or anywhere in your bones rather than your joints, that's more typical of Bartonella. And also another telltale sign of Bartonella is pain in the bottoms of your feet. So you might get up in the morning and the bottom of your feet really hurt. It feels like you're walking on glass or just real pain. Oftentimes it gets misdiagnosed by the medical establishment as plantar fasciitis because it kind of looks like that. But it is, Bartonella has a very clear bottom of the feet pain symptom. And again, it can come and go. It's not constant. Some of the other co-infections are, as I mentioned before, Ehrlichia and anaplasmosis. I used to be able to say Ehrlichia, you knew you had Ehrlichia because it comes with a spiked fever and you end up in the ER and they treat you. It oftentimes will come with like 104, 105 fever. And so you used to be able to kind of say that's a telltale sign of Ehrlichia. But there's now another Borrelia on the scene called Borrelia miyamotoi. It's not Lyme disease, but it's in the family. And that comes with a spiked fever. So sometimes it's Borrelia miyamotoi, not Ehrlichia. There's also relapsing fever, which is another Borrelia. So, and this is fairly new. Earlier on, 5-10 years ago, even IGeneX, tests were coming back negative and you had symptoms of Lyme, and it's turning out that the Borrelia for relapsing fever doesn't necessarily show up on the Lyme test, so you have to test for that too, and they do that now. That's what I mean by these are, it's a whole complex of illnesses that are confusing. Confusing enough if there weren't politics around it, but because the CDC and the Infectious Disease Society have literally, and I've been doing this 25 years, I can tell you without a doubt, there's been a concerted effort to keep this thing tamped down and not present with all the proper information. It's our Lyme doctors, you'll hear from medical establishment, oh, you don't want to go to the Lyme doctor, they're just there for your money, or they're quacks, or what have you. And it's quite the opposite. I mean, they truly are bending over backwards to help people that can't get help anywhere else because the medical establishment just doesn't get the diseases. And again, in medical school, our doctors are being taught the narrow view of Lyme, not the broader view of Lyme, the accurate view of Lyme. So It's not that they're trying to hurt you, they just don't have any idea. And again, through word of mouth, doctors talk to each other and stuff. It's just grown up that when you can go into doctors now, and not all of them, but a lot of them, and you come in and you're armed with all this information and start talking to them, and you'll get labeled very quickly. Oh, you're one of those. You can see it in their eyes. It's like, oh, you think Lyme is real, or you think Lyme is serious, and that's what you're up against. Is the people we really need to see to fix us. Our doctors oftentimes have a blinder on because of the way they've been taught. So just be aware that's there. I often, when I did get calls before I hung up, I'd always say, don't go into your doctor filled with all this information and spew it out, because they'll write you off. Keep your own counsel on some of this. Ask questions diligently, but don't overwhelm them, because they've got their biases, and they'll read you as one of those hypochondriacs or something. So, and then there's a couple new ones on the scene, or one other new one on the scene, Powassan virus, which you guys probably have heard about in the news. Powassan virus is, I'd say in the last 3 or 4 years, has shown up in New Hampshire and in New England. It's not all that common, but if you get it, it can, people do survive from it, but often has caused death, and it can be pretty quick, like from tick bite to death in 3 weeks. So you want to take it seriously. If you get sick, hopefully, and if you're deathly sick, if they're not tested for it, somebody bring it up, and your family member bring it up, because there have been cases in New Hampshire where people have died from Powassan. Let's see. So one of the reasons I'm so happy the Leos did this is because of the impact on the kids, and I mean I can't stress enough, as was said in my bio, I organized a group in Connecticut called the Committee for Educational Reform for Children with Lyme Disease. I had a like-minded group. We were all in Fairfield County, that had kids that had been tops in their class, top 5 or 6 in their class, all out of school completely, all with tick-borne disease, all in different schools in the area, high schools, and so the parents all got together. We kind of found each other and formed this committee with the intent that we could educate the schools on what these kids are dealing with, and what the schools could do, because the schools really don't understand it at all, and they're dealing with it without even knowing it. It's near and dear to my heart, just because I came into this because of a daughter that got so sick. But I do think it's so important to try to get the schools to understand that a lot of the kids that are in special ed may very well be dealing with tick-borne illness. Some born with it, some getting it along the way somewhere, and people are just looking at who they are today, not what's causing it. And if the parents don't know, certainly the schools aren't going to know. But if the schools could be better equipped, I know a nurse. I'm in a listserv with all Lyme doctors around the country and in fact the world, and with some other advocates. And there's a school nurse in New Jersey who's had lost a brother to Lyme. He was an adult. So she's got very educated, and she's in her school. She'll take people aside and say, I have to be very careful because of I can't be doing certain things under school rules and things. But she'll try to, kind of on the QT tell the parents, you want to check this out or check that out in terms of tick-borne disease. But unfortunately, there's just not that many of them in the school that are that educated. So it's again, it can cause learning disabilities of all kinds. It can cause executive functioning deficit. It can cause ADD, depression, migraines. And by the way, Babesia is a very classic. One of their symptoms is migraine sometimes. Isolation, because the kids are unable to function. They can't. They have such severe fatigue, they can't be with other. They'll make plans to do something with the other kids, and then they have to cancel out because they're too sick or too weak to go. So they get isolated. I know for my daughter, she was lucky. We were in Connecticut, but she was lucky. She had a couple of friends that stuck by her. But mostly you're out of sight, out of mind. You're not in school. When she did try, we'd have her go to a church group once in a while when she was up for it, and she'd come home and she goes, and this was after she was out of school for 2 or 3 years. She goes, I have nothing in common. They're all talking about their school activities, and what do I have to talk about? They don't want to hear about a sick kid. So these kids are dealing with all kinds of issues that they shouldn't be dealing with at that age. Oftentimes, kids, it's very common today if you bring your kid to a pediatrician, that they'll get put on some kind of a antidepressant. They're just a little depressed. Or I know when I was in Connecticut, I was told that a popular thing for particularly adolescent girls that were dealing with Lyme is they'd be, every other one was being put on Zoloft, and doctors thought they just need something to relax, and that's the worst thing. They need, they're dealing with an infection, and one other common one, and again, Bartonella. One of the common symptoms of Bartonella is rage. So if you have a kid or an adult, this happens with adults too. They can go from 0 to 60, all of a sudden be fine, and then something sets them off in 2 seconds. And then particularly with kids, 10 minutes later, it's like they don't even act like they remember that they were like that, or they just kind of back to normal. That's a classic Bartonella symptom. And oftentimes, if you have adolescents that are, have those kind of issues where they're constantly acting up or raging, they go to the pediatrician and they get diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder. When I hear oppositional defiant disorder, I would tell you every single one that's diagnosed with that should be checked out for Bartonella, because I think a lot of them are typically going to find that they have Bartonella. So I just think our kids are our future, and so many of them are being denied futures because people just don't understand, what they're going through and what they have. So through all of that, I've kind of talked or alluded to the politics of Lyme, and basically there's what we call the Lyme literate community. Those that understand Lyme have been in, patients and doctors and advocates. There's a organization overhead of that called the International Lyme and Associated Diseases Society. You can get to their website by going to ilads.org, and there's brochures at your table that come from them. These are the Lyme. This was formed way before I even got involved in this, and has grown from there. It's most of the major Lyme literate doctors, or most of the Lyme literate doctors around the world belong to that. It's an excellent organization, truly on the forefront of all the information regarding Lyme and tick-borne diseases. So if you ever have need to go to a resource, that's probably the top one. Again, when I talk about the doctors, it's also the hospitals. The hospitals don't understand Lyme, so very often you can go in there, and if you're there because you've got a pretty sick situation. Somebody's pretty ill, and oftentimes they're not picking up that it's Lyme, so you're not getting treated properly. Or if they do diagnose it or recognize it, they don't necessarily know how to treat it properly. They'll treat short term. So the medical establishment's alternative to ILADS is the Infectious Disease Society of America, IDSA. So they have the guidelines that the CDC thinks everybody should follow, all the doctors follow, et cetera. And those guidelines are, just as I went through earlier today, filled with so many flaws and piece of misinformation. So that's kind of what we're up against in terms of the politics. And the good news is Bobby Kennedy, I think, has kids that had Lyme. He may have had Lyme himself, and he has worked with some of the people I know in the Lyme community. They formed a committee, and they're trying to change things. He knows the CDC's way behind on this, so there's some hope that maybe the medical community will finally come around. But there's a long catch up ahead. So that's pretty much it. By the way, just to talk about it, there's two standards. When you hear standard of care, the IDSA standard of care is the one I talked about. 2 or 3 weeks of antibiotics, maybe 10 days, and if you aren't better after a course of antibiotics, and they might, some doctors might even say, well, I'll give you another couple weeks and see. If you're not better after that, they might tell you to go see a psychiatrist, or they might, meaning it's all in your head, or they might call it post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, because they believe, this is what the medical establishment believes, is that after 3 or 4 weeks of this or less, you've killed all the bacteria, so anything that's lingering are just symptoms that will go away eventually. They're just kind of, the system has to get back in order. And that's not true. If you still have symptoms, the odds are very high you still have infection. By the way, one other Bartonella symptom I should talk about is oftentimes will show up as a rash that looks like stretch marks, so long red lines. Might be on your torso, might be on your back. So if you ever see that, that's a pretty good sign that you have Bartonella. That's pretty much my talk. I do run a support group in Bedford called the Greater Manchester Lyme Disease Support Group that meets the third Wednesday of every month at 6:30 until 9. And I also have a group in the library in Bedford that was meant to be a walk-in group, that it's kind of just a drop-in. Anybody wants to come and ask a question and leave, they can. I'm there on the second Thursday of the month from 6:30 till 8:30. And that's it. I will open it up to questions. I hope I didn't put